Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Scottish History for Dummies by William Knox, Ph.D. Narrated by Matthew Waterson. Introduction. This book is about Scotland, a small island nation on the edge of northern Europe. And for 80% of the period covered in this book, Scotland didn't exist. At least, not as we think of it today in territorial and political terms. Territorially, Scotland only assumed its current boundaries in 1470 with the acquisition of Orkney and Shetland, and politically, it was only a nation-state from 1314 onward before voluntarily giving up its sovereignty in the Union of Parliaments with England in 1707 to create a new nation-state, Great Britain, a move that was deeply unpopular with ordinary Scots. But in spite of its small size, just under 19 million acres, and several centuries of independence, Scotland has made a massive contribution not only to the history of these islands we call Great Britain, but also to the modern world. Indeed, some historians have argued that Scotland, through its thinkers, engineers, and scientists, invented the modern world. Although Scotland has been a unitary state since 1470, it's divided by geography. The Highland boundary fault line, which runs from the northeast to the southwest, separates Scotland not just geographically into highlands and lowlands, but also culturally. The lowlands had rich, fertile farming land. The highlands, with its harsher climate, had many more mountains and rivers, but the soil was extremely poor, so rearing animals, especially cattle and later sheep, was the main source of income. Yet, for much of our history, more people lived in the north of Scotland than in the south. Such are the many contradictions in the Scottish story. Scotland is also wetter and windier than the rest of Britain, with the Shetland Isles experiencing around 42 days of gales per year. Hearing can be a problem in that part of Scotland. Scotland also shares a part of a larger island, Britain, with its neighbours, the English and the Welsh. As far as the English were concerned, we were noisy neighbours who were there to be subdued. The relationship between the two kingdoms for most of the period covered in this book was, on the whole, fractious and violent. But it was the territorial battles with England that were important in creating a sense of national identity for the Scots, something they have never lost from the Middle Ages to the present day. About this book. In this book, I don't give a blow-by-blow account of the history of Scotland, from the earliest times to the present. There isn't enough space and, in any case, it would be boring. This isn't a textbook, and it doesn't pretend to be. It reflects my views as a historian, just as most histories reflect their authors' points of view. I leave things out, I skip over things that seem irrelevant, and include things that I hope you enjoy. For any historian, the decision on what to put in and what to leave out is ultimately conditioned by the sources available. So earlier chapters of the book are concerned with issues surrounding kingship and the relationship between church and monarch. Later chapters discuss elections and party politics. The information is organized into chapters and parts so that you easily access what you need. Use the book as a reference. You don't need to listen to the chapters in order. You aren't expected to remember anything. There won't be a test at the end of the book. Sidebars and anything marked with the technical stuff icon are skippable. The information is interesting, but not necessary to your understanding of the topic at hand. Finally, as you listen to this book, and any other history, keep in mind that the wealthy and powerful left more traces of their lives than the poor and the illiterate did. Until relatively recently, 90% of men and all women were denied a political role in Scottish society. So, all history has a certain bias, and the story is never complete. The past is continually being reinvented. That's what makes it so fascinating and something we can all play a part in making. Foolish assumptions. In writing this book, I've made a few assumptions about you, the listener. You studied some Scottish history at school, but were put off by the way it was taught, or maybe you liked it, but your memory is a bit hazy about who did what. You haven't studied Scottish history, but you're interested in doing so, and you're not sure where to start. You enjoy a good story and want to know more about Scotland and its peoples. Icons used in this book. Throughout this book, you see pictures in the margins. These pictures are called icons, and they're meant to draw your attention to key pieces of information. Here's a guide to what the icons mean. Remember. The Remember icon alerts you to the most important information, the elements of Scottish history that you don't want to forget. Technical stuff. Sometimes my historian brain likes to go on a bit about details that aren't essential. When this happens, I mark the text with the technical stuff icon. If you're pressed for time, you can skip anything marked with this icon. On the other hand, if you listen to it, you're sure to find fascinating tidbits of information. First hand. When I quote famous historical figures or others, I mark the quote with the first-hand icon. Beyond the book. In addition to the material in this book, this product also comes with some Access Anywhere goodies on the web. Check out the free cheat sheet at dummies.com/cheatsheet/Scottish history for a guide to the historical periods of Scotland, a list of Scotland's rulers, and the major events and battles in Scottish history. You can also find online articles that extend the content covered in the book. I provide links to the articles at the beginning of every part. Whether you're looking for information on the Vikings, the Black Douglases, or the Treaty of Union, you can find it, and more, at dummies.com/extras/Scottish history. Where to go from here? You're more than welcome to start listening to this book at the beginning and work through it until you reach the end. But you don't have to. You decide where you want to go and how far. If you want to know about William Wallace or Robert the Bruce, head to chapter 10. If you're more interested in Scottish nationalism, turn to chapter 16. The choice is yours. The story of Scotland is rich in drama and character. All you have to do to discover it is listen. Part 1. Getting started with Scottish history. Web Extras for Dummies can help you get started with lots of subjects. Visit dummies.com to learn more and do more with For Dummies. In this part, find out about the ages, ice, stone, bronze, and iron, as well as some weird and wonderful stuff about prehistoric peoples like the Celts and their world. Look at the battles fought by the Romans and the four main peoples of ancient Scotland, the Angles, Britons, Gaels, and Picts. Discover the origins of kingdoms in the struggles of the ancient Scottish peoples against Roman domination. Consider the arrival of Christianity and the saints who spread the gospel, like Columba and Ninian. Chapter 1. Welcome to Scotland. In this chapter, getting acquainted with the people who make up the land we call Scotland, seeing how Scotland was formed, examining how Scotland gained, lost, and regained its independence. When you think about Scottish history, maybe it takes you back to the classroom, where you heard stories from teachers about great heroes and villains. You may have stamped on your brain tales about great men like Robert the Bruce or William Wallace, or women like St. Margaret or Mary, Queen of Scots, or maybe the great explorers like David Livingstone or Mungo Park. You would have also heard of villains like Macbeth, or failures such as Bonnie Prince Charlie. These are all wonderful stories in their own right, and they receive their due in this book. But there is more to Scottish history than simply the doings of great men and women. And in this book, you can find out more about this nation than a history of the usual suspects can tell you. The peoples of Scotland. The history of Scotland is a truly remarkable one. As a nation, Scotland has probably contributed more to world civilization than any other country of a comparable size. In fact, you could argue that the Scots, through their historians, philosophers, engineers, and scientists, invented the modern world. But how did that come to pass? What was it about the people and their history that allowed them to make such a significant contribution to the modern world? You couldn't put your finger on anything in the Scottish past to answer that question. For many centuries, nothing in particular distinguished the Scots from people from other parts of the globe. Indeed, you could argue that for most of Scotland's history, it has lagged behind other societies, including, wait for it, England. There aren't any genetic clues either. Ancient Scotland was made of at least 5 different peoples who spoke different languages. At first, they were simply members of tribes searching for food, but later they became farmers and members of small kingdoms. Of course, Scotland didn't exist in their minds. Borders and things like national identity were pretty meaningless. Since ancient times, other people have settled in Scotland. The Romans came, saw and tried to conquer but left empty-handed. Much more successful were the Vikings, who arrived at the start of the 9th century. The Vikings not only raped and pillaged, but, in time, also settled on the islands and on the northern coast, and became Christians. They were followed by the Anglo-Normans, who arrived in the reign of David I. They were given lands and eventually became successful and powerful members of the Scottish aristocracy. The Bruce and the Stuart families, who were rulers of Scotland at various times, were from this stock. From the 12th century, we had to wait until the 19th century for the next major influx of people into Scotland. This time, it was the Irish, and this influx proved a bit more problematic. The Irish arrived by the thousands in the west of Scotland in the 1840s, fleeing the famine. Their religion made it difficult for them to integrate into Scottish society, which was staunchly Presbyterian. However, they eventually succeeded, only to be replaced by other immigrants from the British Commonwealth in the late 20th century. This last movement of people into Scotland has been on a scale much smaller than experienced in England, but still, 1 in 5 children in Glasgow schools is from an Asian background. So we are, in a famous Scottish saying, "Or Jock Tamson's bairns." There's no such thing as a genetically pure native Scots. We are a hybrid people, and the better for it. The formation of Scotland. When it comes to the formation of Scotland, we can start with the Romans. They did little for Scotland except unite the various tribes of the north against them. In fighting the Romans, the tribes realized that bigger was better. When the Romans arrived at the tail end of the 3rd century, there were 17 different tribes. When they left, there were only 4, Angles, Britons, Gaels, and Picts. In the middle of the 9th century, Kenneth MacAlpin united the Picts and the Gaels, and the new territory was named Alba, or Scotland. But he didn't control the whole of Scotland. That was not achieved until 1460, when the Norwegians ceded Orkney and Shetland as part of payment of a dowry. So, what we now recognize as the boundaries of Scotland took a long time to be fixed. Of course, the sovereignty of the kingdom was always contested by our friends in the south. Successive English kings tried to incorporate Scotland into their realm without much success. The most determined attempt was by Edward I toward the end of the 13th century. That led to a national struggle for independence and made heroes of Robert the Bruce and William Wallace. The result was English recognition of the Scots' claim to be an independent nation. But it didn't end there. The Scots battled the English right up until the Union of Crowns in 1603, when a Scottish king, James VI, became the first king of England and Scotland. The crowns were united, but the nations were not. After about half a century of religious strife and battling the Stuart kings, the parliaments of the two countries were united in 1707 by the Treaty of Union. The Scottish Parliament voted itself out of existence. Why it did so is a matter of debate. People are still arguing over it. However, it meant that a new country called Great Britain was born, and the Scots had to learn to accept that they were British first and Scottish second, which they gladly did. Scots were happy to accept what is known as a dual identity because they were incorporated into the British Empire. They were quick to recognize a good thing when they saw it. So extensive was Scottish involvement with the Empire as administrators, traders, and soldiers that people have spoken about the Scottish Empire. Access to new markets and sources of raw materials saw the Scottish economy begin to take off. On the backs of native genius inventors like James Watt, who invented the steam engine, Scotland became an industrial powerhouse. Scotland led the way in engineering, iron, steel, and shipbuilding. Although Scotland beat the world in technology, it was also breaking records for the wrong reasons: the highest rates of squalor, poverty, and disease in Western Europe. The late 20th century saw Scotland lose its lead in industry to other countries like Japan and Korea, and as a result, Scotland transformed itself from a maker of ships to a maker of chips, electronic ones, but Scots like the potato ones too. All the old skills and occupations have gone, and in their place have come new ones associated with what's euphemistically called the knowledge economy. In the past, Scots went down pits. Today, they work in brightly lit offices and shops, but in many cases for much less money. With each successive stage in the country's development, Scotland's sense of identity has undergone change. From a land of a myriad different voices and cultures, it became fiercely nationalistic as a result of the struggles with the English. Then it learned to embrace a new dual identity, which, from the 1970s onward, became more nationalistic. Unlike the old forms of nationalism, which were exclusive and masculine, the new identity is inclusive of all Scots, regardless of gender, ethnicity, or race. Remember, identity is never fixed, it's fluid, and always in a state of forming and reforming itself. In that respect, Scotland is no different to any other country. The union with England and its uncertain future. Scotland and England formed a union in 1707, but because no one was certain it was going to last, it was half-hearted and left the way open for a divorce. The English were in a hurry to get an agreement, so the Scots were able to negotiate a deal that allowed them to retain a separate legal and educational system and secure guarantees regarding the independence of the Church of Scotland. No Anglicanism here, thank you. So, in spite of it being the beginning of a new country, each of the partners of the Union had the building blocks of a nation-state intact in case they wanted to go their different ways in the future. Scotland had become a nation within a nation. The survival of these institutions was of no great importance at the time, but their very existence kept alive the memory of an independent Scotland. No one doubts the Scottish commitment to Britain and its empire, but even at the high point of imperial pomp and circumstance, there were complaints about the way England had begun to stand for Britain. Instead of the British Empire, it was commonplace throughout the world to talk of the English Empire. As a result, people in Scotland started to demand some form of home rule, where the Scots controlled their own affairs, but matters of national defence and foreign policy were still the responsibility of the Westminster Parliament. However, as long as the British Empire stuffed the mouths of the middle class in Scotland with gold, the moaning was confined to a minority. Along came war in 1914, and the moaning became even quieter as the Scots responded more enthusiastically than any other part of Britain to fight for king and country. They also took the biggest hit. The cause of nationalism didn't really get going again until the late 1960s, in spite of the formation of the Scottish National Party, SNP, in 1934. Scots were content with their dual identity. After all, they'd fought another world war to defend it. But things started to go wrong in the 1970s, and by the end of 1974, the SNP found itself the second largest party in Scotland, with 1/3 of the vote in the second general election of that year, and 10 members of Parliament, MPs. Both the Labour and Tory parties were worried, so they agreed to hold a referendum on devolution in 1978. But they rigged it in such a way that at least 40% of voters would have to be in favour. Many general elections have been won with less than that. The Scots were to have their own assembly, but at the last minute they got cold feet, and the dream was over. Things went back to the political status quo. It was once more a two-horse race, Labour versus Tory. But the genie was out of the bottle. The support for nationalism declined, but it didn't disappear. All it needed was another spark to ignite it. Step forward, the best recruiting sergeant nationalism ever had, Prime Minister Margaret Hilda Thatcher. At first, Thatcher's election and the determination to roll back the frontiers of the state hey, we're subsidy junkies, saw a massive increase in the Labour vote north of the border. Yes, while England voted for the Tories, even trade unionists, in Scotland it was Labour. It seemed as if the Scots were being governed by an alien government. There was a democratic deficit of enormous proportions. We didn't want the poll tax. We didn't want to chant the greed is good mantra. We didn't want to fight the Argies, Argentinians. After a visit by the grey suits, Thatcher was gone by the end of 1990, and the Tories were out on their ear in 1997. By that general election, they had no MPs left in Scotland. It was a Tory-free zone. Teflon Tony Blair became Prime Minister in 1997 and promised a referendum on a Scottish Parliament. The Scots, in a historic vote, opted to restore their Parliament, which had been in abeyance for more than 300 years, and it sat for the first time in 1999. The Parliament was set up in such a way that it encouraged power sharing. The first government was a coalition of Labour and Liberal Democrats. However, the tide of opinion in Scotland was flowing toward the SNP and its leader, Alex Salmond. Salmond did the unthinkable at the last general election and won a majority. Immediately, another referendum was on the cards. This time, the stakes were higher. Independence would mean the breakup of Britain and an end to a union that had stood the test of time for 300 years. Whether it will come to pass, who knows? It's still not clear whether the vote for the SNP is a protest vote against the failings of New Labour and the present coalition government, or whether it's representative of a genuine wish of the Scottish people to regain their independence. Only time will tell. What kind of history? History depends on documents or texts, which creates a bit of a problem, because for most of human history, people have been illiterate. The creators of documents tended to be the educated elite, and if you go back even further, only clerics. Kings needed clerics and clerics needed kings. So most of the documents that survived from the medieval period concern the church and kingship. The ordinary Scot was more or less invisible, a mere footnote in celebrations of great deeds and daring do. Following the spread of literacy from the late 16th century onward, other voices began to be heard, although the history of great men still dominated. It was really only from the end of the Second World War that these other voices began to be taken seriously by historians. The Second World War was a people's war, and that led to a people's history. The working class began to appear in history books. From the 1970s on, so did women. History had ceased to be only a story about the rich and powerful. It had become more inclusive, telling the stories of previously marginalized groups and peoples, homosexuals, gypsies, unusual religious sects, and many more. Chapter 2. From Nomads to Farmers, the Earliest Peoples. In this chapter, considering the first people who visited and settled in Scotland, looking at the Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age in Scotland, identifying the people who came to Scotland from throughout Europe, envisioning everyday life for Scotland's first settlers. In this chapter, I cover a greater period of time than the rest of the book put together. We can date settlement of Scotland to some 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, but we don't have much of a clue about the earliest settlers. So much of what is written about them is guesswork, but intelligent guesswork. Because history relies on the written record, which didn't exist during this period, what we know of the lives of the earliest settlers is derived almost solely from archaeology. However, it seems clear that well before the birth of Christ, we moved from being people who only hunted or foraged for food to people who herded animals and grew food. In other words, from nomads to farmers. We know very little about Scotland's ancient ancestors, but a number of things stand out. They lived through different ages, which lasted much longer than the period of recorded history. These ages were identified by the kind of raw materials, stone, bronze, and iron, used, and the technologies that developed around them. Perhaps the biggest change in the history of mankind was the transformation of the nomadic lifestyle into settled communities. That laid the basis for the evolution of more complicated societies. As the basic needs were met, The surplus could be used to maintain people, such as artists, kings, priests, and warriors, who did not work the land. In this chapter, I walk you through these earliest days of Scotland's history, before anyone had even heard of Scotland. Technical stuff. Technically, we can't speak about Scotland in prehistory, because boundaries didn't exist. But I use the term Scotland throughout this book to refer to the land we think of as Scotland today. Boundaries and landscape, the first people to inhabit Scotland. The first map of Scotland was drawn up by the Roman Ptolemy from his geography, written in the 2nd century AD. The next map was drawn up 11 centuries later by Matthew Paris, a monk of St. Albans. But for most of this period, Scotland was uninhabitable. It was too cold. Indeed, most of Scotland remained covered by glaciers when the cave paintings of Lascaux in France were created sometime in the 14th millennium BC. It was only when the Ice Age began to come to an end in the 11th millennium BC that we have any evidence of human activity in the frozen north. When the ice caps began to melt, they had clearly made their impact on the landscape. Earlier sea levels had been lower, so Orkney and its islands, as well as many of the islands that make up the Inner Hebrides, were attached to the mainland. When the ice melted, they became islands. The melting of the ice caps allowed for human habitation. As I mentioned earlier, Scotland was inhabited something like 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. Evidence drawn from archaeological finds shows that from 6000 BC, men from the south travelled up to Scotland and stayed for a few weeks, eating deer, wild boar, and fish. Visitors also crossed from Ireland and did pretty much the same thing. These visitors were nomads, people searching for food wherever they could find it. But some of them must have settled, even if for a short time, because the remains of Scotland's first house from 7,000 years ago were discovered at Crathis, near Banchory, Aberdeenshire. This circular stone structure measured about 7.6 metres, 25 feet across, and housed 8 or 9 people. Prior to the Bronze Age and 1,000 years before the Romans arrived in Scotland, complex societies existed. All we have as reminders of them are the mysterious stone circles, the henge monuments that can be found all over Britain. But there are other structures to consider. Chambered cairns like Maes Howe in Orkney were built to honour the dead, and many were built before the pyramids. At Maes Howe, the stone slabs, some weighing 3 tons, are so closely fitted together that you can't insert a knife blade between them. The Ages of Man, the Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Ice Age in Scotland. Although it's a bit unscientific, archaeologists and historians tend to think of the transition from nomads to farmers in terms of ages. An age is defined by the technology that is used to make tools and other objects. So the 3 main ages of man are the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. The Stone Age. The first settlers were hunter-gatherers, who were active in what is known as the Middle Stone Age or Mesolithic period. The tools used by people during this period were made of stone, which gave rise to the name Stone Age. The polished stone axe heads that you see displayed in museums are probably the best-known Stone Age tools. During this period, people hunted animals and then processed the hides for clothes and shelter. From around 3,500 BC, farming became a way of life. Human beings realized that herding and growing their food would be easier than struggling to find and kill it. Stone Age people settled by the sea and on the islands. Travelling by land meant having to cope with forests, swamps, and wild animals. For this reason, water became the only means of communication between these island communities. Most of these settlements were small in size, but not without knowledge of each other. Skara Brae in Orkney, preserved by a freak sandstorm, is the finest example of a new Stone Age or Neolithic period village in northern Europe. It housed about 30 people who shared the accommodation with their animals. Old traditions of a nomadic life slowly died out, but by 2000 BC, communities in most parts of Scotland had settled on the land. The Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is thought to have followed the Stone Age and began around 2000 BC. Bronze is made out of an amalgam of copper and tin. It grew in popularity because it was easier to work with and shape than stone.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?